there's so many ways the Jets could go. I mean, does anybody have a real solid lead on this? Because I've heard you say they could trade up, they could trade down. I mean, everything is up on the table, right?
Yes. Thanks for having me. Always good to be with you guys, first of all. And yeah, this is one of the more fluid situations that I've covered. Like when you're in the middle of the first round, it's really hard. When you're in the 10 to 30 range, it's hard. Usually the Jets are in the top 3 or something like that. It's pretty easy to pick then. But a lot of different things could happen. I think obviously they're focused on offense. They're not going to draft a defensive player. And it's probably going to be a pass catcher or an offensive lineman. I would say probably pass catcher at this moment, but they could trade back for an offensive lineman. There's a handful of guys they really like. So you're right, Michael. It is virtually impossible to get a 100% ironclad prediction on this.
Do you have any guesstimation on how much Aaron Rodgers input there would be on an offensive pick?
Well, it's interesting that in Rodgers' career as a starter, going all the way back to 2008 with the Packers, he's never had a first-round receiver or tight end drafted for him. So I think the Jets may make some Rodgers history tonight. I think he has some input. I mean, he has said, and, the Jets have said that they solicit input from him, and why wouldn't they? I mean, the guy knows as much, maybe more football than anybody in the building. He's been around the league for 20 years. So, is he in the draft room saying, no, I want this guy over that guy? I don't think he's going to do that. But I definitely think they used him as a sounding board to get his feel on what the particular needs might be on offense.
Now, are they against or are they wary? Because, the new narrative is that you should not take a tight end with a high first-round draft pick. We keep hearing they love Brock Bowers, but would they be hesitant to take him at 10? Because Kyle Pitts was looked at as can't miss. He had a good first season. The last 2 seasons, not so great. What are the Jets' thoughts on Bowers as far as you know?
Well, it's interesting because, the positional value is not as high as it would be for an offensive tackle. In the last 30-something years, only 3 first-round tight ends have become an all-pro. Tony Gonzalez, Dallas Clark, and Jeremy Shockey, the only 3 out of 30-something years of drafting first-round tight ends. So it's unusual. And also another main point is very rarely do you see a first-round tight end get a second contract with the team that drafted him. So that doesn't happen that often. But, we asked Joe Douglas about that last week, and he said as long as the guy is a dynamic weapon, it doesn't matter what position he plays. He called him a Swiss Army knife, which tells me they don't see him as a quote-unquote traditional tight end. He's not your uncle's tight end. He doesn't line up next to the tackle as an inline tight end. He's in the slot. He's split out wide. He even played running back at Georgia. He scored 5 rushing touchdowns as a freshman, so he can line up there. He's exceptional with the ball in his hand, but, essentially he'll be listed as a tight end, and it is a little unconventional. I would take the offensive tackle, but I think there's a real good chance they would take Brock Bowers.
It's also interesting, Rich, because of the run on quarterbacks, one of the 3 really good wide receivers might drop to 10. Would they entertain that, or are they happy with Garrett Wilson as their number 1?
Oh, they're happy with Garrett Wilson, but they need another receiver. I mean, right now, we all saw what happened to Alan Lazard last year. He basically ended up in the doghouse. And Mike Williams is he going to be the Mike Williams of a few years ago? I don't know. He's coming off ACL surgery. He probably won't even be ready until week 1. So, yes, they absolutely need a wide receiver. And I'm glad you mentioned it. I do see a scenario where one of those top 3 receivers falls to the Jets at 8.
Yep.
If it's Neighbors or Dunze, I definitely think the Jets would take him over Bowers. I think they'd be tickled to have one of those 3 wideouts fall to them. I also think there's a chance that they could move up to 8, Atlanta's going to draft a defensive player. I think we all know that. And they could probably get the same guy at 10 that they would get at 8. So why not just trade down a couple of spots? So I could see the Jets moving up 2 spots to grab a Roma Dunze or a Malik Neighbors.
Would they? Is there any chance, Rich, that somewhere like in the 3rd or 4th round or whatever, if a quarterback drops that they like to that level, that they'll grab him? Or do they risk ticking off Aaron Rodgers if they did that?
No, they're not going to tick him off if they do it in the third round. I mean, I think it would be blindsided if they did it in the first round. It would be Jordan Love all over again situation. But yeah, that'd be classic. But no, I don't think that's going to happen. But yeah, I definitely think more on day 3 of the draft. You know, when we asked Douglas about taking a quarterback, he basically sounded like he's very interested in taking a quarterback. Clearly, they have a need. There's a job opening now. They traded, what's his name? I already forgot his name. No, I'm kidding. Zach Wilson traded, so they need a guy to replace him. They're looking for a developmental-type quarterback. Joe Douglas, and this raised some eyebrows in the press room when he said it, but he goes, we want to become a quarterback factory. So
yeah, but the first car that came off the line, it was a clunker. How could they start a factory?
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, they got a long way to go to become factory level. They want to be like the Packers of the 1990s. You know, they had Brett Favre, and Ron Wolf was smart enough to keep drafting quarterbacks in the late rounds like Mark Brunell and Aaron Brooks, and they were able to flip those for draft picks in later years, which was just smart business. But they had Brett Favre, you know, so they knew they had Favre and then Rodgers. The Jets, you know, what's the future beyond this year? We don't know. I mean, so I think the Jets will take a guy like Michael Pratt out of Tulane or Jordan Travis out of Florida State. I think those would be the 2 quarterbacks to watch.
Well, the glorious pick, the pick that I'm excited for this Jets team, Rich, is good old pick 203. The one that we never thought would happen, acquired from the Denver Broncos in the Zach Wilson trade, which I have to admit, I'm pretty impressed that Joe was able to pull this off. A, what were your thoughts? And B, anything to look for in those last 3 picks in the 6th and 7th?
Well, it would be funny if they took a quarterback there, which is entirely possible. But look, we all knew Zach Wilson was not going to be on this team this year, despite what Woody Johnson said at the owners' meetings last month in Orlando. He said, well, we'll just keep him if we can't trade him. I don't think anyone really took that seriously. This was always going to end up with Zach being sent away. So they got very little for him, and they're paying half his salary as well. So it's almost like they had to pay someone to take him off their hands. He didn't have much market value. We all know that. You know, he landed in a good spot, though. I mean, I think he's got a chance. I mean, unless Denver drafts a first-round quarterback, I think they'll have a chance to do something there in Denver and maybe resuscitate his career. But, yeah, I do think that, to me, the fun pick is the last pick in the draft. The Jets have the Mr. Irrelevant pick, and they haven't had that pick since 1969, the year after they won the Super Bowl. So that'll create some headlines as we get through this.
You know, there are so many narratives surrounding Zach Wilson, and you saw every snap of his career. Was he betrayed by all the change on the Jets, the offensive coordinators and things like that, or was he simply not good enough?
He wasn't good enough, Michael. I mean, he's had, granted, now, was it the ideal environment to develop a young quarterback? No. We know that. The Jets have said that. You know, changing coordinators, not having an experienced coach, making him play right away instead of grooming him a little bit. They made mistakes along the way. But I think it's lazy to blame that as the reason why he was a failure in New York. He just wasn't good enough. I mean, statistically, I could throw out 100 stats. He's one of the worst quarterbacks in the last 20 years in the NFL, like historically bad. So I don't think that happens, you know, because he couldn't learn his offensive coordinator wasn't great. It's on the player, and it was a bad draft pick. I mean, we can't excuse Joe Douglas here either. The player was overdrafted. I think the only saving grace for the Jets is that the guys who were drafted right after him, you know, bombed out too in their first team, and they all got traded in that quarterback class, except for Trevor Lawrence, and even he really hasn't lived up to expectations. So it's on the player. He just wasn't good enough. His mechanics never got fixed. His lower half was just out of whack. That's why he couldn't complete short passes. He just didn't process quickly. You know, he would lock onto one receiver, and they made incremental improvements, but going from like bad to slightly less bad is not going to cut it in the NFL, and that's why he had to go. Talking
to our Jets reporter, Rich Cimini, Rich, I'm thinking maybe Jamarcus Russell, and Ryan Leaf. I mean, he's one of the worst top 2 draft picks of all time. Is that unfair?
Well, I think he's the worst Jets draft pick of all time. And I know some people are going to throw out Vernon Golston or whatever, but when you consider the position he plays, it's the most important position, where he was drafted, number 2, I think it's not even an argument. I think Zach is probably the worst. I mean, Vernon Golston stinking for 3 or 4 years with the Jets did not change the course of Jet history. Zach Wilson stinking for 3 years did change the course of Jet history. So I think without doubt league-wide, yeah, he's got to be up there with Russell. And I posted a stat the other day. There's a stat, analytics geeks like this one. It's called EPA per play, expected points added per play. Out of 122 quarterbacks in like the last 25 years, he's ranked 121st.
Wow.
Out of 122, and the only one worse is Blaine Gabbert.
Wow. That's amazing. That's amazing. Now, I look at this draft, and it's kind of a weird vibe for Joe Douglas because, Rich, usually when like Joe Shane is drafting for this year and for the future for the Giants, the future means nothing to Joe Douglas. He's really zeroed in on this year. Guys that can help him this year, he might not be here next year if they don't make the playoffs. Is that an accurate assessment?
You're right. Everything he's done this offseason is for today. It's not for next year or the year after. They signed a whole bunch of those guys, short-term deals, older players like Tyron Smith and Hassan Reddick. It's all about this year. And, I don't think Joe wants to mortgage the future, and he's not going to do anything damaging. But you're right. It's all about now for him and Robert Saleh and this entire regime. And that's why when you talk to people around the league, their feelings about the Jets are like, Joe's got to win now. That's why he's going to take Brock Bowers. He needs a guy to come in and make an instant impact. So that's why there's so much Brock Bowers sentiment out there. And I do think there's some credence to that. I know they really like Brock Bowers. Now, do they like him enough to take him at 10? I think they might, but I know they really like him.
All right, so in closing, you would take an offensive lineman, but if you had to, somebody said, okay, you got to tell us what the Jets are going to do, you think they'll take Bowers?
Yeah, if Odunze and Neighbors are gone, I think they'll take Bowers at 10. That was my mock the other day on ESPN for our show. I'll stick with that. I think the offensive line scenario comes into play if they trade down and they get a guy like a Tali Fuaga, who I'm told Joe Douglas really likes. If they can get him at 13 or 14 or 15, that would be like a win-win for the Jets. Get a good lineman who might not start from day one, but I'm sure will get playing time during the year, and you pick up an extra draft pick along the way. I think that would be the win-win for the Jets. But like I said, Odunze and Neighbors, if they're gone, then I got Bowers at 10.
See, that would be my pushback with the offensive lineman they trade down, because Rich, he wants somebody that can contribute right away, and they've got their 5 offensive linemen. Now, a couple of them probably are not playing 17 games, but the guy you pick is not going to start right at the beginning, so it's not instant effect. So he's got to weigh that too.
He's got to weigh that, but I mean, who's to say if they draft Tali Fuaga, who's a really good right tackle, who's to say that Morgan Moses is, his job is not etched in stone for the entire year? I mean, Morgan Moses is 33 years old. He's coming off of pec surgery, and he only makes $5.5 million. You could certainly put him on the bench and make him the swing tackle. I mean, if Fuaga or Olu Fashanu from Penn State, if they're that good, you play him right away. And the left guard, John Simpson, they only gave him $6 million guaranteed. That doesn't mean he's got a lifetime appointment to be a starter for the Jets. I mean, he could get beat out by a guy like Troy Fautanu, the guy from Washington, who would be a really good left guard. So you're right, Michael. If they draft a tackle, probably not a day one starter. But given their injury history on the line and given the fact that some of these guys are older, I think there's definitely the possibility to play this year.
Rich, enjoy the evening. We thank you for giving us part of your time.
Always a pleasure, guys. Enjoy the draft.
All right.
Take care.
That's Rich Cimini, and you could hear the draft on the ESPN New York app. Just hit the tile, and you can listen to the whole thing on the ESPN New York app. The hardest thing about getting into shape is taking that first step, isn't it?